In Philadelphia, the owner and the GM are attached at the hip. The quarterback got $50 million per year. And there was this story in ESPN, which we all read. And if you're listening to this, you probably read or at least know about Bill Belichick this offseason. And there was a lot of great stuff about Bill Belichick in there. But one thing that I think got underplayed locally and nationally was the Eagles' involvement in that article. And for those who don't remember it, it basically said that teams that have a head coach, some teams that had a head coach, at least considered the idea of going after Bill Belichick. And the Eagles were one of those teams. And then it downplayed it and said, well, Jeffrey Lurie came to the conclusion that you don't want to blow up the whole franchise, the whole operation for maybe 2 years of Bill Belichick. And so there were Eagles fans when I talked about this on the Ringers Philly special. They said, oh, come on. They did. The conclusion is they didn't do it. And I said, no. To get to the point where that thought's in your head, to then get to the point where, well, it's probably not worth it. Like, there's a line between A and B there where you had some consideration, some discussions internally. So Nick Sirianni is entering his fourth season as the Eagles head coach. He's won 67% of his games. He's been in the playoffs 3 straight years. He's gotten to a Super Bowl. And yet I thought the man was getting fired at the end of last season. He didn't get fired. They bring in Vic Fangio. They bring in Kellen Moore. They kind of strip him of all of his power and basically say, just manage the people we are putting in place. We are giving you a good team. We're adding Saquon Barkley. The pieces are in place. Just don't screw it up. And so there's a scenario. If the Eagles win the Super Bowl, if they get to the Super Bowl, and I think they're among the 3, 4, 5 contenders in the NFC, where we're saying, wow, Nick Sirianni's 4 seasons as a head coach, he's been to the Super Bowl twice. He's been to the playoffs every year. He might be a Philadelphia hero by the time we get to the mid-February. And then there's the other scenario, because the bar is very high. This isn't like make the playoffs. This isn't win 10 games. If you go win 10 games and are out in the first round of the playoffs, I feel pretty strongly that Nick Sirianni's not going to be the head coach going forward. And then league-wide, if other teams are looking at this and saying, man, he couldn't make it happen with that offensive roster, with Vic Fangio as his defensive coordinator, I don't think he's going to be a hot name to be a head coach in next cycle. I mean, he could be looking at a coordinator job. He could be looking at something completely different. So it's this weird situation where you have a Super Bowl contender where it's known that the head coach is basically coaching for his job. And as I just described, it could go in either direction. So that's why I took the layup. I didn't overthink it. I went with Nick Sirianni.
I love this. Yeah. I mean, we had to have this conversation. I had him on my list as well. So I'll dip into my backups when we get further in this conversation, but I completely agree. The things that I would add just in terms of ratcheting up the pressure is I think there's also a situation in which you have Shane Steichen potentially thriving in Indianapolis. Maybe, a season wears on and Anthony Richardson becomes one of the stories of 2024. And we're looking at it and going like, oh, wow, guess we know who had the real magic of how to make things work with a mobile quarterback like that. Right. And then one of the things that had been a calling card for Nick Sirianni all of a sudden is called into question. Even your guy, Jonathan Gannon, it hasn't been so bad. It really hasn't been so bad. The thing that I can't quite figure out, and I'm curious, Lindsay, how you think this how you would sort of like sort through the likelihood of different scenarios playing out here, is what Vic Fangio means inside this dynamic in Philadelphia, just in terms of, on the one hand, that should make things a little bit scarier, I think, if you're Sirianni. When you have someone who is, the easiest interim, if things go really badly, right? And there's a mid-season move or something, that's easier to do when you have someone on the staff where it's like, oh, that's cool. We know he knows how to do it. Potentially it's just temporary. I do wonder if that would require a little bit of relationship management with Fangio if the move is to then call up Bill Belichick at the end of the season. But broadly speaking, I totally agree. Lindsay, I was posing to you what you think the presence of Fangio sort of adds to this dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it eliminates a bit of the like potential excuse making, in that this is the second year in a row where Nick Sirianni has had to replace both of his coordinators, and it failed pretty miserably the first time when he had to replace both Gannon and Shane Steichen. He found himself in a position where he was
Matt Patricia guy
turning his defense over to Matt Patricia in the middle of the season. And you kind of can get maybe like one mulligan there, right? Like, okay, you promoted some guys from within and it didn't work. And, we're trying some different things. Well, you brought in Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio, who are both very proven, established coordinators who have like fairly clear identities of what a Kellen Moore offense is going to look like, and certainly what a Vic Fangio defense is going to look like. My big question and what I wrote down, because I obviously had, maybe not obviously, but I had Nick Sirianni on my list here too. And, I think my big question is, and this is one that our colleague Ben Glickson at The Ringer likes to pose to us internally a lot, is what exactly does Nick Sirianni do? Like, what do you do here? And, I remember, Sheil, you wrote about this a lot and talked about this a lot during their Super Bowl run a couple seasons ago, was that like, he just, when things are going well, he has like a really good like pulse on the team. And during that season, and especially during that playoff run, like he just like the vibes were really good and he knew when to challenge. He knew when to get up emotionally. He knew when to rein things in. He was really like in sync with Jalen Hurts and what Jalen Hurts needed. And like, personality wise, they're very different. So like it worked well. But like if you're a vibes coach and then like your team collapses in embarrassing, like historic type of fashion, like they did last year, a lot of that's on you. And like, I think that the coaches that he brought in, Vic is like, he's kind of like a grumpy old guy, right? I mean, he's
kind of,
okay, very much
prototypical grumpy old guy.
Yeah. And like, but like, he carries a lot of weight in that room. He's going to have a lot of authority over, everything that happens on that defense. And he didn't leave Miami because he was a bad coach. Like it was just, there were personality conflicts going on. It wasn't the right fit. There were a lot of players who were very happy to see him go. So it's just like the vibes are going to be really, really interesting. And like Sheil, I'm really excited for you to like go out to a couple of days of Eagles training camp and like hop on Philly Special and tell us just like what the vibes are like out at NovaCare. Cause I think it's going to be really, really interesting because there is so much pressure on this one person. What is the offensive identity going to be like? What does leadership look like kind of in this post Jason Kelce era? Like this is a team that's going to face some adversity, and can they do it better than they did last season? So they're really one of my most interesting teams to watch this season. And Sirianni's right at the top.
Yeah, it's a wild mix because I mean Vic Fangio had his opening press conference and he was basically like ripping on load management in the NBA and like he's like players today haven't changed, just the people around them. And you know what organization believes
such a good bit.
Yeah, what organization?
So good. That's like so good. Old man defensive coordinator.
I agree.
Energy.
I was so jealous. I'm like, shoot, I should have had this as a take like last year or something.
Well, you are looking for guest hosts periodically now in Philly Special. Let's invite him on.
Right. Bring him in.
Actually, I love that for you on Extra Point Taken to just randomly, like a couple times a year, just come in and like rip one off about a completely different sport.
I'm adding it to my notes. I have a spreadsheet here somewhere. I mean, but the personality dynamics. I mean, you mentioned Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio. It's like, all right, did Nick Sirianni maybe like kind of approve these, but like Nick Sirianni, he doesn't really have the authority given how last season ends to be like, I'm going to, put my stamp on here are the guys I wanted. And then you have an organization that believes in keeping guys healthy and having a kind of a low key training camp to not run players into the ground. And now you have Vic Fangio coming in with a totally different style. Like Nick Sirianni is going to have nothing to do with the defensive side of the ball. He made like a throwaway comment that, well, now that I'm not so as involved in the offense, maybe I'll check in the defensive meeting rooms once in a while. I'm like, Vic's going to have those doors locked. Like you're not getting in there, my friend. Sorry. And then Kellen Moore, like you bring in Kellen Moore with the idea that like, here are some nice pieces. Like I've said it, but this is the best group of skill position players the Eagles have had in my lifetime. I mean, when you look at it, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts and Dallas Goedert, like, what is Donovan McNabb thinking about this? What is Doug Pete? Like, they didn't have anything close to these guys when they played. And so it is an interesting mix. Sirianni's job, I guess, is just to kind of manage the personalities, be sort of the culture coach. But to your point, he's not the steady hand. Like Jalen Hurts is sort of the steady hand, stoic. Nick Sirianni is like, yelling at Chiefs fans after a win or letting this thing snowball to the biggest collapse in NFL history. So there are so many factors at play. There's such a high variance team for 2024.